Pixar had made 6 movies, and the 6 movies combined gave them a profit of $3.231 billion. And this gives each movie roughly $528.5 million. Steve Jobs started Pixar with $1 billion and sold it to Disney in 2010 for $7.4 billion. That's what Steve Jobs can do. In the meanwhile, though, Apple needed a CEO and needed money quickly. So Steve agreed to sell next to Apple. Apple immediately agreed. Now Steve Jobs was back as interim CEO and was pushing himself again for a new product. This time, he was a legend in the music industry. The iPod. The iPod sold over 4.5 million units 2 years after it came out. Had you ridden through Cupertino at that time, you would have seen it everywhere. It was that big. And it wasn't all. Even though Steve Jobs now was a legend in the computer-making industry, the movie-making industry, and the music industry, he still wasn't done. At his own TV show, the Macworld Expo, he launched into a speech about a new product. One that was smaller than a pack of gum. It could hold about 100 songs. The iPod Shuffle. In 2007, he released the iPhone. And in 2009, he released the hugely popular iPad. Now let me move on to marriage and children. Steve Jobs was first married to Chris Ann Brennan. But after they had their first child, Lisa Brennan, he refused to admit that Chris Ann was his wife, and Lisa their daughter. As a result, they later divorced. But later, when he returned to Apple, he met Lord Powell, and is now currently married to her. He has also accepted his first child, Lisa Brennan. His other 3 children are Reed Paul, Aaron Sienna, and Eve. As of now, Steve Jobs has passed away on October 5, 2009. He died because of pancreatic cancer, a disease he fought so hard against. The next day, Apple made their homepage a picture of him and had a bagpipe playing in his honor. Those who were fortunate enough to work for him were very sad, and his dear family and friends mourned over the loss. The revolutionary icon was only 56. Now let me move on to mistakes. Steve Jobs has made many mistakes in his life. One of his first mistakes was working his workers harder than any human could possibly work. He made them work 90 hours a week and outraised half of his employees. As a result, he got kicked out of his own company in 1985. But not only did he lose his job, he lost his reputation among the public. Now he had to build back that reputation, which he did with Next. His second mistake was the fact that he did not accept Chris Ann Brennan as his wife and Lisa Brennan as their daughter. This also brought tons of negative comments about him. These are some of the mistakes that Steve Jobs has made. Now let me move on to criticism. Steve and Apple have received many criticisms. For example, everyone thinks Apple is a cheap company because all they do is add one more app and call it a new product. That might be reasonable, but what I think is more important than that is the fact that they're building things you could have possibly never dreamed about 4 years ago. Another criticism that Steve usually receives is being the hardest boss to work for. He makes his workers work 90 hours a week on average, and outrages half of his employees. Although now most people agree that he had gotten easier to deal with near the end of his life. Now let me move on to rejection. Steve Jobs has been rejected many times. Had he given up though, we would have never seen the amazing products we do today from Apple. When the Macintosh series was first proposed, it was rejected. But Steve kept fighting and made it a minor project. Had Steve never been kicked out of Apple, and had Steve never started Next, we would have never seen the mind-blowing OS X software we do today. These are some of the rejections that Steve Jobs has faced in his life. Now let me move on to outstanding achievements. Steve Jobs has had many outstanding achievements. One of his first achievements was starting a company in a bedroom, then changing it to a garage, and then making it the most wealthiest technological company in the world. His second achievement was building the first computer with a keyboard attached to it. He has also built one of the skinniest laptops in the world, and given it one of the most complicated softwares in the world, the MacBook Air. Here is also one of the best-selling laptops that Apple has made, the MacBook Pro. Now let me move on to awards. Steve Jobs has received many awards. Recently, he won the Mobile Industry Personality of the Year award. In 2010, he won the Time CEO of the Decade award. He also won the Time People Who Matter award. And also recently, he won the Jim Henson Award for positively developing gadget owners. Now let me stop there so we can actually leave this place without talking about awards. To top it all off, Apple was named the most admired company in the world in 2008, 2009, and 2010. Now let me move on to quotes. Here are some of the interesting quotes that Steve Jobs has shared in his life. And I quote, "We started out to get a computer in the hands of everyday people, and we succeeded beyond our wildest dreams," said Steve when he was interviewed by a Time reporter. This reveals a lot about the man. He was not rich or greedy. He just wanted a good-looking computer in everybody's hands. And I quote, "No one was in it for the money," said Steve about Apple. This is supported by the fact that although Apple was worth over $300 billion, that Steve only got paid $1 a year at Apple. And I quote, "That's been one of my mantras, focus and simplicity. Simple can be a lot harder than complex, because you have to work hard to keep your thinking clean. But it's worth it in the end, because once you get there, you can move mountains." So just because something is simple doesn't mean it's bad. And just because something is complex doesn't mean it's good. These are some of the interesting quotes that Steve Jobs has shared in his life. Now let me move on to why I chose Steve Jobs. I chose Steve Jobs because he's a person who stands out in the community. He has an unbendable will and is not rich or greedy at all. He forgets the mistakes he's made in his past and fixes them in the future. These are some of the qualities that I love about Steve Jobs, and I will take on to my future. Now let me move on to what I learned in confidence class. I learned a lot in confidence class. I learned that rejection is not the end of the world, and how to handle defeat without getting too emotional. I learned to take criticism in a constructive way and not be angry or sad at the criticism. I also learned to speak confidently and to express my opinions no matter what. These are some of the things that I've learned at confidence class. Now I would like to thank the judge, Mrs. Aurora, for listening to my speech. I would like to thank Vidyanti for giving me this opportunity to express my opinions on Steve Jobs. And I hope those of you who did not like him at all, or were neutral, now know that Steve Jobs is a more interesting man. I would like to thank the audience for coming here to listen to my speech, and I would like to thank my classmates for helping me on the speech. Now I would like to open the floor for questions, starting with the judge.
Steve Jobs was kicked out of his own company. What would you have done if you were placed in a similar situation?
Well, after going to the confidence class, I would take that criticism and rejection in a constructive way and see what I did wrong and start a new company if I had to.
How important is being focused in your life?
Can you repeat that?
How important is being focused in your life, in doing whatever you want to do?
Well, being focused helps a lot, because if you don't know what you're aiming at, you don't know what you're doing, and you're randomly doing things. So being focused is what keeps you going.
What is one main important thing that you learned from Steve Jobs?
I learned a lot from Steve Jobs, but the most important thing I learned is to take everything to its finest detail and have an unbendable will and take criticism in a constructive way. personally feel the iPhone is the best Apple electronic gadget because it was the first to revolutionize the way we use the phone. The first iPhone.
Is there any other like inventor you would choose instead of like Steve Jobs?
I was actually first thinking Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, but I figured Steve Jobs was a more positive man and chose him.
Parents start getting lined up for the experience sharing. The audience will start moving on. तो सबको ही इकट्ठा कर लो.
Yeah, I've already used a video.
What happened to Apple Company because he died? So what's
Well, now they have a new CEO, and they're apparently in a downward situation at the moment, but they're looking to come
Experience
back
sharing
with
by
a
all the
new
parents.
invention they call the
Like
iPhone,
program, so
which
you
was
can keep
supposed
them
to be
engaged.
released with the Steve Jobs,
After
but
that, thank
the
you. After the
unexpected
judges
death
have this.
delayed the release.
Yeah. When she's giving out the final judgment, so right now everybody will line up and talk about the class and their experiences to the audience.
The first device that they made was like they called it a computer, but it was just a circuit board with all the electronic components without the screen or the keyboard. And they were selling them for $50 each.
How old was Steve